Welcome back to the next part of the Walker Bulldog Tamiya M41 1/35th kit. As you can tell, work has happened. We've gone ahead and assembled all the road wheels, all the return rollers, drive sprockets, idlers. We've gone ahead and textured the back exhaust covers. We've filled the bottom holes of the hull. We've gone ahead and, I've gone ahead and put some evergreen strip in to simulate periscopes for the driver's vision ports. The turret has been assembled in the upper and lower halves. Texture has been applied to the front, and we've replaced a weld seam on the side. We'll get over in a second, and I'll show how I did that on the front. But as far as the hull goes, I have found references that show the exhaust covers. Now these are just sheet metal covers. The actual mufflers for the exhaust are under them, but I have found references that show the covers themselves being completely rusted. I have found them where they show them partially rusted. I have found them where they show no wear or rust on them at all. So I'm going to do a sort of 50-50, and I've gone ahead and stippled on some Mr. Surfacer 500 with a small brush, this one, to get some texture on there for the rust, so it looks a little bit better textured, the actual mufflers and the exhaust pipes as well. And then when we go to paint, we'll paint the whole thing in a good rust tone, vary that up in shades. And then when we go to paint, I'll do some hairspray chipping over the exhaust covers to show the wear on those. As far as filling the gaps on the bottom of the hull, part of the issue is when you look down where the exhaust is on these two little gaps, without covering it, you can just see straight down and see daylight, which wouldn't look good for pictures. And instead of just covering this little back part, which is all you have to do, I went ahead and covered everything. Now part of the issue is the way the upper hull contacts the lower hull. I couldn't run this the whole way on here because it would interfere and push the front up too much, so I just had to cut in on the side some to clear the lower hull, which meant I had to put some backing material over here on both sides so it had something to glue to, and so when you push in, it doesn't just flex in and break the seal. I had a whole video I did on doing this side, and it was way too long, way too rambly, and it was pretty much garbage. So I'm not going to show you, and I'm not going to rip it off and do it again. But it's very easy. You just need to use some strip stock or whatever sort of reinforcement that you want to do, and then just lay over the black sheet stock. And then hopefully you can tell the edge is green. After you put this down, you don't want to see any of the black thickness, and you don't want to add any thickness on the side. So what you do is you come back with a sander at a very low, almost flat angle, to where you're taking off the thickness from the edge, so you don't have it on the sides. And then you come back inside and sand the sides flat to restore sort of a square look to them, to where when you look at it from the side, once it's painted, you won't be able to tell that these were filled in. As far as these little white strips go for the periscopes, which the kit doesn't have, it's just like it is there, a blank opening, which doesn't look that good. So I used some square tubing, split it down the middle, and I'm using that to represent the periscopes. And we'll go ahead and put this other one in a second, and then after that's done, we'll reinforce the back of these with the same nail powder and monomer mix that we did on the lower hull to fill those gaps. That way we can sand these all sort of even and level, and then figure out if it's worth it or not to cover up the bottom of them with some styrene, so when you look down you can't see into the hull, though I think once the hull's closed up that won't be a problem, so we may not do that. But it's, as far as getting the periscopes done like that, it's very easy. You just either with a knife or a small saw cut down the middle, and then you can sand the top square again if how you cut it wasn't square, and then you just take your hobby knife, cut it, get some tweezers and your cement. Again, MEK is what I like to use most of the time. You find the square end that you have, which is this end, hold it with the tweezers, glue the end that you're going to stick to the bottom part of the hull, and then you just stick it on. Now, one of the things you do need to do is, one, center it. And you can tell right now it's not too centered in where it's supposed to be, so you just look at it and move it to where you want it and make sure it's mostly centered in the vision port. And the other thing is to set the depth of it to see how far back you want it. Now this one's back a little too far. We'll put a little bit more glue in there so it can slip a little. It's slipping a lot, but then you just push it forward till you have it where you want it, because you want it to match the others, and this one's still back a little too far, so we'll move it forward a little. Make sure it's square in the opening again, or even in the opening, I should say. You can tell it's not really even in terms of the gaps. A little bit more. Okay, that's where we want it. Push down and then come back and put a little bit more glue on it to help set it. Double check the depth, double check it's centered, and then just make sure it's seated. And that's how we're going to replicate the periscopes that the kit does not come with. Now, I am going to end up spraying black in this area before I attach the upper hull to the lower hull. That way, once it's done and we go to prime and paint, we don't have to worry about making sure we have primer or a dark color down in these. So when we get done, you look down, you can't see any of the white. So that's really all the work that we need to do on the lower hull, or all the work we want to do on the lower hull before we ended up attaching it. Or excuse me, all the work we're going to do on the upper hull. Haha, upper. This is the top part. I have to remember. Anywho, that's all the work that I want to do before I attach it, because there's going to be a gap on the front and back that are going to need filled and sanded, and I don't want any of the lights or any of the other things to get in the way of that. So the upper hull is done for now. Back to the turret. Now, one of the things you have to be careful of when you glue the upper and lower halves together is, one, you want to make sure that the gun mantlet, you don't glue the way where that installs, so you still have it moving so you can set the height later. Once we do set the height, we'll end up gluing it so it won't move. But as you can tell, the shape of the turret, you're gluing along this edge here, which is really quite a ways from where you can apply pressure. Part of the issue with this is, same thing with fuselage sides for aircraft, is when you apply pressure here, top and bottom, it can actually open up that gap again. Even after the glue set for a few days, that seam will still be a little bit weaker. And to stop that from happening, and to stop that seam from showing up all the time because you've been handling this, I went ahead and, hopefully you can see some of it, I went ahead and reinforced the seam with again, the acrylic nail powder and monomer. So when you push on these, this side will not flex and open back up. Then I applied, again, the cast texture after I sanded these seams. Now, again, references show that this front portion of the turret is sort of one piece that they weld to the rest. So even though with the kit you have the half that goes all the way up here, and there's a seam, that seam should not be there. Now this back seam, what I've already done with some putty to get the weld seam back, this seam from the 2 turret halves in the kit is supposed to be there, but it still looks better if you add the weld seam back to it like we have, and I'll show you how to do that again on this side. And stippling, and this is a plate that gets bolted on, so that's why there's no cast texture on that. But doing the cast texture is very easy. I like to use Mr. Surfacer 500, but you can use any thinned putty. I will say that it's best to use a lacquer-based putty like Tamiya's putty or Bondo or Mr. Surfacer, because it'll actually bite and grab onto the plastic, to where as the opposite of that, a water-based putty like Vallejo or Perfect Plastic putty doesn't really bite to the surface very well, and it can kind of come off. So that's real easy to do. It's the same way I added the texture on the exhaust covers. You just use a small brush and stipple it on. As for the weld seam, what we're going to use is Bondo 907, the glazing and spot putty, which is a very good filler. And it is lacquer based, so you have to be careful, because if you say you want to set nose weights into the nose of an aircraft to make it not be a tail sitter, it is lacquer based, so it can wrinkle or melt the plastic, so you don't want to use too much of it in a space like that. But for something like this, it's fine. The only thing is it's a little thick. So what we're going to do, get rid of that, is I like to use little tattoo ink cups. The only problem is sometimes they have a little nub on them. So you got to cut that off so they'll sit flat and not wobble. What we'll do is we need 2 of them. I'm also going to use some regular lacquer thinner. 4 in 1. This will be for cleaning our brushes and for thinning the Bondo, because it's a little too thick to my liking right out of the tube for doing what we want to do. So squeeze a little out. Seems to be a big air pocket I'm dealing with in this tube, of course. Now part of the problem with Bondo, as you can see, it's kind of liquidy, and I don't want that liquid. So I'm going to get a tissue and absorb some of that excess liquid from the tube, and then push out more. And this is just the watery where it's sort of separated. And I don't want that. I want the thicker putty that's in it. Same thing if you're messing with oil paints. We're finally getting some of the putty coming up. Getting a little bit of the liquid. Now, it's up to you whether you can keep that liquid and use its own sort of juice to thin it. But we're going to use just regular lacquer thinner, and I want this to a pretty thin consistency. Now you could add the weld seam back with Mr. Surfacer 500, but I like to use lacquer thinner and Bondo, so it's a different color, and I can see better where I'm laying it and the difference in what's already been put down. So a little bit of lacquer thinner into here, and then you just mix it up, and the dogs are going at it. Quiet all morning until I get out here. And then, rah, 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 rah. We smell something in the wind. Now this is all personal preference. You don't have to add this weld seam back in. You could just go in and fill it, or you just sand it, or just leave it. A lot of guys choose that, or think that just leaving it, the natural seam from the kit, is good enough. But I like to add a little bit of a texture to it. It's a little too much putty on the brush. I like to use a small flat brush because I want to do a thin weld seam. It's just a case of brushing it on. Now you don't want to be and put this on too thick, because these weld seams were not that prominent. I mean, you're not doing a Russian armored vehicle from the Second World War, which had nasty, dirty weld seams that they didn't really clean up when they were doing things. So you don't need too much, and you don't want it to be too textured. As you can see, we're just painting it on. Again, I like to use a flat brush to keep it flat. And so you just want to load the very end and make sure that the brush stays flat. And then follow the curve up here. And then back there some. Now this is a little bit thinner than what I did for the other side. So I'm going to go back over, and the good thing about the Bondo stuff, there's a helicopter. The good thing about the Bondo stuff is it dries really fast. So you can go back over the same area you just did and increase the texture some and get the height up a little bit. And I did mix a lot more than what we needed. The bad thing about it drying so fast is if you're doing a big weld seam, your pot of stuff can dry before you're done. But if that's the case and it starts to set up too much, just add a little bit more lacquer thinner, and it'll thin it back out to the consistency that you want. So I'm just going over and looking at where I want it a little bit taller or a little bit wider. And just carefully and slowly building it up in the areas that I want. Now some guys like to run tape along the joint, and so they don't have to worry about it going too wide, but I think that makes the edges too clean looking and doesn't really represent very well in my eyes a weld seam. So that's the weld seam we have. Nice thin line, matches pretty well to the other side. This one may be a little bit thinner, so we'll go and we'll just make it a little bit wider. And it's always a constant battle of how wide you need to make it to represent the effect well, but to keep it in scale. And keeping it in scale is sort of the hard part. And the other thing this also does, if you didn't get a good glue joint, or you didn't sand the seam very well, this can help you fill some small voids and sanding marks, so you don't have to worry about gaps or anything with the finished seam. So that's as easy as it is. You just take it and go along the joint. Now we went a little wide down here, so what you take is a scraper of some kind, the back of a knife or something, and you can sort of just go along the putty and scrape that part off. And there, in about 20 minutes this will be completely dried. And one of the other good things about using Bondo is that it does dry pretty dry. And what you can come do afterwards, if you're not happy with the texture, if it's a little too rough, you can just run your finger across it when it's dry, and that'll kind of break off the really jagged marks or the rough areas that you don't really want. So that's the weld seam and how to put back a weld seam. That's the same thing we're going to do when we attach the upper hull to the lower hull in the front, because there's a weld seam on the front that we need to replicate. We're also going to, when we glue these together, do some cast texture on the front here. I found some references that show a subtle cast texture on this. We're not going to do the Mr. Surfacer 500. I'll show you another technique to get a more sort of subtle cast texture, and that's just taking a sea sponge and sponging on some paint, and that thickness of the paint will give a good subtle cast texture to the armor plate. Get that hair off. So the work on the upper hull in terms of sanding and messing with the joint and the cast texture is done. We just have the little things to glue on, and then that will be it for the turret. But we'll get to that later, because there's some other things I want to point out for some of the things on the upper hull, including the commander's hatch that are sort of important to note when you're building this kit. So in the next part, I'll glue the upper hull to the lower hull, and we'll work on sanding and working on the seam on the front and the back. So thanks for watching. Hopefully this was somewhat informative to some techniques that are good to replicate some nice textures and to put back some detail that a kit like this, an older kit, doesn't have. Now, the whole upper hull, from what I can tell, are cast armor pieces. So if you really want to get technical about it, you can redo cast texture on the whole upper hull, but I'm not going to bother with all of that. I kind of want just the front part to represent that and to give us some good texture variance in the turret, because when it comes to the overall look in the end, it's really about textures and layering, and we'll get to more of that once we start the painting and weathering. So again, thanks for watching. Hope this helped. See you soon with the working on the, or the next episode I should say, working on the upper hull. Catch you later.